Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jürgen, and thank you, organizers, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me first share my screen. So, do you see my slides?
Yes, I can see them.
And it's the right screen, right? So
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so it has been, of course, a very interesting set of presentations in the past 1.5 days. And what I will discuss today also touches upon some of the questions already raised before. And I hope we continue the conversation still for the remainder of the workshop. But indeed, I would like to discuss with you the topic of societal dynamics, different social interactions, behavioral change, and etc., and how we integrate that in computational models, especially when we talk about climate change. Of course, I think it's not a surprise for this audience that, of course, climate change is an urgent issue, and we hear almost every other week yet another piece of news about another climate-related, unprecedented, and very often life-changing events throughout the world. that also, of course, this type of climate-related hazards bring billions of damage. They impact thousands of lives usually, and also leave quite an unmeasurable emotional footprint. There is no reason for us, in other words, to actually assume that our behavior and our choices, including our economic choices, would actually remain the same as we experience these events. But the question is, how is it represented currently in the models, and what we can do about improving these representations? And that's what my talk will be today about. Of course, when we talk about changes, we have to realize that, of course, we talk about complex adaptive socio-environmental systems that are always changing. They're constantly adapting and evolving. But that this dynamics could be of two types. Of course, we could observe something like a linear trend, which is very, of course, convenient both for decision makers, but also for modelers, for scientists, because we could look back into the past and with confidence extrapolate into the future. At the same time, there is increasing evidence, especially in various environmental, especially ecological systems, now climate systems as well, that the trends are not always linear, that these complex systems could experience regime shifts or critical transitions, systemic risk, non-marginal change. These are terms from different disciplines, but in fact, at their core, they represent the same phenomenon. And they could come, of course, these systemic changes could come either due to an external shock, but also through endogenous systemic changes that would develop even under gradual pressure. And there is a lot of evidence of it, both in environmental systems, but also now increasingly in social and economic systems. And what is very quite clear, especially on the social side, is that such phenomena, which is better documented in the financial sphere, for example, like a run on a bank, is always accompanied by some perceived risks and diffusion of information and the social contagion that occurs in the society. But whenever the systems do experience this shift, what we observe, in fact, is that very often the system moves into a new regime, and that is the one with new properties, new structure, sometimes new feedbacks, and new underlying behavior of the components of the systems or agents if we talk about social systems. So if we look a bit closer into climate-induced risks and the topic of social tipping points that has been, of course, discussed also in the past 2 days, very often what happens, of course, what we know, we observe that there is increase in climatic stress, both increase in the gradual variables, climatic variables, gradually changing climatic variables, but also extremes. And very often how we measure that back in the socioeconomic systems is through aggregated economic losses and the increase of those. What we document less is that there is also a loss of livelihoods in some locations, usually on the global south, but not only. But as long as this, but usually what happens, of course, that this triggers a chain reaction. So whenever people experience this type of adversities, there is always an issue of probably relocation or even large-scale migration that also leads to the loss of social capital and the networks that are usually place dependent. These effects further could create indirect impacts on the markets, leading sometimes to market collapses, the entire market collapses or structural shifts in those. There are also indirect losses throughout the different economic sectors, not only in the region where the climate impacts are felt, but also through the trade networks throughout the country or even the globe, depending on the impact. That also leads to the increase of inequalities in the society and the changes in the social acceptability of risks, but also of different policies and currently practiced policies. In some places, of course, it leads to social unrest and instability. But even if this step is skipped, what we do observe that there is, of course, changes in power of different groups and changes in political institutions, regulations, and changes in social norms. That would if this cascaded reaction is really triggered, very often what we arrive at is the eroded status quo. But it's very important to understand that there is a variety of socioeconomic mechanisms that are at play in this chain. So there are self-amplifying feedbacks that are being triggered. There's compounding effects of social vulnerabilities and climatic hotspots. Heterogeneity plays a big role because it's all about redistribution of these impacts, but also of the climate adaptation policies, for example. And path dependence is very strong because it locks us into specific adaptation or development pathways. Of course, whenever the status quo is eroded, we could actually, the social tipping points, multiple actually of them are triggered, and we could move either into some sort of managed transformations or could end up with negative consequences where there could be regional collapse or lock in the undesirable pathways, and sometimes poverty traps for part of the population. So there are quite a few challenges in understanding, representing, and modeling these processes. Not only we do have pieces of theory that explain these processes, but not all of them are well connected with each other. We still miss data, especially on these institutional changes. We have more and more data about behavioral change, but changes in institutions are worse documented, and they also require long time horizon and capturing those rare events. We also know that past data would not necessarily be representative of how we will behave in the new future, in the new normal. So we reviewed it a few years ago with colleagues. We reviewed actually, we were interested in how can we model these regime shifts endogenously, and we reviewed different types of models, actually asking about different components of the models that a model should contain to be able to represent it. I won't go into the detail, but just would like to show that neither of the four methods we considered would be ideal, so to say, but they all have pros and cons. But in general, if we want to model this type of structural shifts, ABMs performed a bit better, but ideally you would like to integrate several types of models to properly represent these processes. But I will talk today, in the remainder of the talk, I will zoom into agent-based models, and there were a few already presented yesterday and today. So I assume that most of you would know it already, but of course, what we want to do is to represent the decisions of different actors, as well as rules according to which institution functions in a computational model. Usually we do that in a spatially explicit way if we want to represent some different climatic impacts. interactions and learning is very important. And especially when we have to deal with these climate-induced risks, it's of course very important to understand how people make decisions. And Pia yesterday also led us into the detailed story and what social sciences have to say about this. But in brief, yes, risk perceptions that are changing are very important. There are different behavioral biases. Memory of the hazard events could be fading, but could be updated as well. Social influence play a role, and we learn and we adapt. So, and increasingly, there are more and more agent-based models that simulate this type of processes. Very often we start with a classical, some sort of classical theoretical model where the assumptions are relaxed, usually with the help of a few or one behavioral theory and data on heterogeneity, on the representation of bounded rationality, on the representation of interactions and social networks in the model, as well as learning. A variety of data is being used both on the system level, but also on the agent level. So we increasingly use data from lab experiments, surveys, and participatory work and social media now. And in my team, we work with different type of hazards and different type of applications. But of course, I can talk only about one today. So, and I will talk here about one of the projects. It's a Veni project, which I did. And I worked also with a PhD student here. And we looked into the floods and how they impact property markets. So both individual decisions and market institutions were present in the model. And why this is important, why we wanted to include market, because actually a lot of data about, unless we do this by surveys, a lot of data about how we value risks, and that is a major number that enters cost-benefit analysis and policy design. It depends on how this is captured in housing prices, for example. But we know that people value nice places to live, but usually these amenities are correlated, spatially correlated with risks. What we also know that at the moment, let's say a hazard hits a specific area, a specific city, the prices for houses that are impacted would drop. And but it also decreases even if it was a nearly missed event. So there was actually no damage, but just the information about risks penetrated. But these effects are only temporary, so they disappear within 5 years. And the whole question is how that would play out with climate change when these probabilities are changing. So in this case, developed an agent-based model. It was a model of a market. So there were buyers and sellers who would trade houses. They would have different incomes and preferences for location, like environmental amenities, but also different perceptions, which could be coded in by using different theories. We use a lot of data in this model. In fact, a lot of market transaction data across 17 years with 2 floods in between, surveys and interviews. And what we also paid a lot of attention into how we actually specify these choices or that in terms of how people make decisions under risk. We tested, for example, here before we ran the surveys, we tested 3 behavioral theories. And what the model was producing is practically dynamics of prices, or there are many other things, but we had the data to validate it against the dynamics of prices and so-called price discount. So the price discount is actually a difference between a house in the safe zone and the flood zone. So, and this difference is was something on which we had data. And what we did, we ran the model, for example, with these different agents following different theoretical assumptions. And we compared the price discounts produced by the model under different, let's say, for example, prospect theory with different reference points or expected utility or risk negligence. And so that we could actually understand what's happening and to what extent it reflects the reality. And to my surprise, in fact, expected utility, despite a lot of research on for example, the fact that prospect theory is a much better solution here, performed much better without data. So we were questioning why this is the case. And in fact, what happens, of course, is that when flood hits, the prices fall down, but they recover until the next flood when they recover again. And indeed, this is because that happens throughout the world. These are the pictures from Australia, where there was a major coastal storm that eroded, but this area was recovered. That happens also in 1978, 66, 45, 1920, has been happening a few times in the past 10 years, because we rebuild on the same place in the same way. The question is, of course, with climate change, if events intensify, we expect that the housing markets would not recover in some places. And that's what we wanted to test with the agent-based model. In fact, we complemented it also with a large-scale survey in the US across several coastal states just after Hurricane Harvey. And we used protection motivation theory here to develop the questionnaire. I don't have time to go in the details, but I just wanted to say that there was, of course, the statistical analysis done separately for buyers and sellers. And what we know is that what we figured out from the data is, in fact, that people use two heuristics. If they never experience flooding, they decide more or less rationally. But as soon as they do experience a hazard, the effect of fear and sort of even irrational avoidance of the flood zones would tip in, and they would just try to go somewhere else. So we coded these decisions and this switch in the heuristic in the agent-based model, and we ran it for two coastal cities, one with a lot of areas in the flood zone, almost 50%, and another with only 6. And we ran two scenarios, with one with the single flood, and we monitored how the housing prices dropped, and the scenario with 2 consecutive floods, which happened within 4 years, so before the memory fades. And what we observe is that in the town where there are 2 consecutive events and a lot of properties in the flood zone, actually market expectation changes because fear propagates. Those agents also have social interactions in the model. And because economic losses and risk perceptions are changing and diffusing in this little society. So behavioral biases such as loss aversion were kicking in. And later on, they were also amplified by market interactions because certain locations started to become unattractive. And that led to actually a structural change in the market. So what happened here is that it's not that the houses disappear or the land use has changed, not at all. But what has changed is the structure of the society that was settling, of the people who were settling in those flood zones. Practically low-income households were first of all trapped and they could not move out. And second of all, if they want to come and live in the city, they will be forced more or less price-wise sorted to live in the flood zone areas. And as a result, the number of households living beyond the poverty line, below the poverty line, were increasing in both cities, irrespectively of the fact that in the second one, the housing markets recovered. So this path dependency actually led to social segregation in this case, and there is more and more discussion about this. But of course, here we only traced in the data only one time measure, one snapshot in time. What we're doing now, and that will be the talk of Brayton tomorrow, please do come. So we are looking at how actually we are running surveys among households in several locations, also to test how they change across contexts over time. Hopefully that also gives a little bit more understanding. But what is also very important, and I think I'm coming to my conclusions here. So, of course, when we look at the countries at the case I showed you was happening in the US. When we look at countries in the global south, what we usually see is, of course, that the impacts are more severe and the adaptive capacity is lower, meaning that, for example, in this study, Asad, the PhD of mine, also looked into when is migration in coastal Bangladesh happening freely and when people are getting trapped in the location forcefully, or there is a forced migration. So there is the whole decision making behind it. But I just wanted to say that in the global south and north, the structural shifts may appear differently because it would be more salient in the global north when it becomes when the systemic risk actually unfolding hidden under our nose. It's clear that we observe these changes because the more vulnerable people will be impacted, but they have weaker voice and they have less power to change it. So I wanted also to mention that we need to look beyond averages, because very often what we report are the damages, the total economic damages or average economic damages. And this is just the numbers from the 2013 floods in Germany and in the Philippines. Of course, you can make a conclusion probably that the damage in Germany was 4 times bigger, but the societal impacts were uncomparable in 2 locations. So we really have to go beyond this and look at the inequality and the distributional impacts, resilience and adaptation, because these different people also adapt differently. The last thing which I want to mention is that, of course, we need to look at other mechanisms fueling systemic risks. So in this case that I showed you, we looked only at the economic losses, relocations and housing markets and how they impacted different households. Alessandro this morning, for example, within the ERC project, so we are looking at migration and indirect losses as well. And I'm now starting a project where we looked also at the social acceptability of risk and how that changes with experience and social amplification, and how actually policies could be changing because of that. I probably leave it with this. I just would like to summarize that, yes, societies do cope, learn and adapt and self-reorganize in face of environmental change. And we do have models that are capable to trace some of these changes, not all. Agent-based models and specifically become increasingly empirical, also about socio-behavioral factors, biases and learning, and cumulative effects of these private actions could be substantial, but modeling societal institutions is really vital if we want to capture tipping points. And there is a number of open challenges that remains, and I'll leave it with this. I will be happy to, of course, also, I would like also to say thanks to the team and to the students who worked with me and who are working, and I will welcome, of course, questions and discussions.